Welcome to the Hunting Beast Report, a live video podcast with Dan Infalt and host Jeremy Gillespie.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Stealth Outdoors. The off-season's a great time to rehab your gear, so head on over to Stealth Outdoors at www.stealthoutdoors.com to pick up some climbing stick wraps, cam buckle covers, platform cable wraps, or stealth strip rolls for all of your miscellaneous silencing needs. Today's show is also made possible by Hunting Beast Gear, innovators in mobile hunting gear and the designers of the Beast Sticks and Beast Stand. Check out the latest products at www.huntingbeastgear.com. And now, on to the podcast. All right, today we're live with Dan Infalt, as always, and very special guest, Dr. Bronson Strickland. Dr. Strickland, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Oh, I appreciate you joining us, and talking to you offline. It's apparently the first time you and Dan have met, so that's an interesting fact. Dan seems to know everybody in the deer world.
Nice to meet you, Dan.
Nice to meet you, Bronson.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. Big fan of your work. So for people that don't know, Dr. Strickland runs the Mississippi State University Deer Lab, does a lot of research and specifically GPS collar research. So we're going to talk about a bunch of that today. But before we do that, Dr. Strickland, for people that aren't familiar with you, why don't you give us a little bit of your background, bio, how you got into research biology, and an overview.
Okay, just give me the signal to, if I go too long, just tell me to shut up. But my background is my passion is deer hunting, and my passion is the outdoors. And so I grew up right outside of Athens, Georgia, and grew up with a rifle in my hand and chasing deer and squirrels and all the other critters. And essentially, when I learned in middle school that there was this career or profession called wildlife biology, and that you could study deer and other wildlife for a living, for a profession, I knew that was exactly what I wanted to do. And so I was lucky enough that my university there, the University of Georgia, had a wildlife biology and management program, got my undergraduate degree there. Then I went and got my master's degree in South Texas at Texas A&M University, Kingsville, and got to work on a really fine 60,000 acre ranch there and just really learned about next level deer management. After that, graduated and then came to Mississippi State to work with Steve Damaris. And while working with him, that evolved into a PhD project. So then I went on to get my PhD here in a deer management project. After that, I left the university for a couple years, and then I was lucky enough to get the job that I have now, which is co-director of the MSU Deer Lab. And so me and Steve Damaris have worked together for 20 years at the MSU Deer Lab. And Steve, and by the way, Steve just retired June 30th. So he has had a wonderful career, and I've just been really, really fortunate to work with him and have him as a mentor for all these years. But Steve's primary role was he was the research arm. I assisted him with research. My job is in educational outreach. So then Steve would assist me with the educational outreach. So that tandem worked really, really well. We worked together on the research, and then we worked together on these educational products, podcast, YouTube channel, etc. And we just have a conviction to make sure that the information that we find that is going to affect deer hunting and deer management, we want everybody to learn about that research.
Oh, it's perfect. We're in a great place. And you, one of the things I wanted to talk about was the Deer Lab specifically and what the mission and goals were, but I think you covered that there. So appreciate that. Let's start off the podcast. People understand that there is a difference between Midwest and Southern whitetails. And before we got online, you talked about there's even an equal difference between the whitetails in the South and the whitetails in Texas. So give us just a broad overview of what you perceive the main differences to be between, Midwest, Southern, and Texas deer.
Yeah, I would say the biggest difference is that in the Midwest and in the South, we generally, never say never, never say always, we generally do not have to worry about fawn production and recruitment. The issues that we are typically concerned with are deer density. And that's why you hear biologists always recommending the adequate doe harvest, keeping your deer density in check with the habitat, et cetera. They have a completely different issue in South Texas because of rainfall. And so you can literally go 2, 3, and sometimes 4 years to where you have very, very poor rainfall. As such, you're going to have a very poor fawn crop. And so literally you have some years where you don't have any fawn survival whatsoever. So it's a different style of management. The landscape is also different. Generally, you have these very, very large land holdings. So a 5,000 acre piece of property in South Texas is small. Some of these are 50, 100, or greater thousand acres. What that enables you to do that is so distinctly different east of the Mississippi is buck age structure. And so literally when you do a survey of a population, camera survey, aerial survey, whatever, you will literally have half of your standing crop of bucks can be mature bucks. And so let that sink in for a minute, especially for people in the Southeast. Half of the bucks that you see on the ground, on the hoof, are mature bucks. And that's just because once you make it through and those fawns survive, then their adult survival is very high. And so if it's a lightly hunted population, those bucks live for a long, long time. So different environment, a little bit different ecology, but the concepts are all the same. Let bucks get old and harvest them when they're mature.
Perfect. Let's shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to share the screen here. Let me get to the right tab. So one of the studies that I've read that you guys, and we're going to talk about this study extensively today, is you guys put out on the Deer Lab publications a buck movement study. And if anybody hasn't read this, I'll put a link in the description afterwards. I should have did it already, but I didn't. So this is on the MississippiState.edu site, the Deer Lab site. If you just Google MSU Deer Lab and then go to publications, it's the latest study under the deer movement. And one of the things I wanted to talk about in this, I'm going to read this from the study, is there is a magnitude in the increase of the distance traveled during the rut to approximately 4 miles a day. And then non-rut movements were about 2.7 miles per day. So could you tell us, there was absolute distance traveled, and I might be messing up, total distance and net displacement. Can you talk about those two things and explain to people what total distance and net displacement are and how they're different?
Yeah, sure thing. So first of all, just a little bit about the data. How did we do this? Well, we have these GPS collars that they're on these bucks, and for part of the year, and in this case during hunting season, and the way we set that was from September until February, we were getting a location. So we get a latitude and longitude measurement off of every buck every 15 minutes. And so doing that, we were able to monitor what we would call more fine scale movements of these bucks during the hunting season. Total distance is exactly, Jeremy, what you're thinking about. It is starting at, say, midnight, and 24 hours later, calculating the distance between every sequential point, every 15 minutes. What is that distance? Next 15 minutes, what is that distance? Summing all of that up for whatever period, in this case, a 24-hour period, and then that is the total distance that the buck moved. Now, what is different here, what we say net difference, or excuse me, net displacement, that is the difference between the location for when the buck started his movements for that 24-hour period and where it ended after that 24-hour period of movement. So the net distance is often much less than the total distance. And so just a very quick thought exercise here. If you had a circle, so if you started at the 6 o'clock position and the buck moved 5 miles and came back to the 6 o'clock position 24 hours later, the net displacement or the net distance would be 0.
Okay.
versus the total amount that it traveled during 24-hour period.
No, I appreciate that explanation. And one of the things that we talk about a lot on this channel is Dan's tactics are bedding centric. So trying to identify not necessarily specific discrete beds, but bedding areas and maybe multiple bedding areas that a buck might be using throughout the season, and trying through various ways to identify like the timing of the year they might be there. And like you said, there's no always and never, but it's kind of a way to potentially put the odds in your favor. So one of the things, Dan, I want to hand it off to you here. Maybe talk about your findings and why even during the rut you still hunt bedding areas, because something that Dan has found in his own personal experience is that even though bucks are moving more during the rut, they're still a lot of times around bedding areas. So Dan, go ahead.
Yeah. Obviously, I've killed a lot of deer around bedding areas, and a lot of what you're saying and a lot of watching your studies and stuff makes a lot of sense with me. I did some studies of my own, which are nowhere near like what you did. But what I did is me and a bunch of people I know put a whole lot of cameras in and around bedding areas and let them soak for like a year. And then we went through and we looked at every picture, and it kind of backed up what I was already feeling from years of hunting. And what I found was a lot of these bedding areas that really looked beaten would have a timing thing, like the buck you're after, because we would target a certain buck or a certain mature buck or something. You'd see a timing of that buck would be there for, say, 2 weeks, but it wouldn't be every day. But it would be, and you don't know when you miss him, too. You can be there and you don't get a picture of him if he comes in or out different, or, because a bedding area would have maybe 50 beds in a 5-acre spot or a acre spot or something. So you could miss him, but you'd see a highlight of he'd be in there at a certain time frame. And what's made me more successful at actually tagging some of them bucks is figuring out that timing. Often you're wrong, but you take an educated guess based on the rubs, based on why a deer would be there, based on food or proximity to does, or but the timing thing really hit with me when I watched your study, how these deer move around and stuff, and how they shift to bedding areas and stuff, but they're always in that same vicinity. And another thing is I had a really hard time. Now I'd get it done and I could do it, but I'd have a lot harder time on, say, now I'm in the Midwest where things are blocked up, but on a very large swamp, like I got one near me that's like 3 miles square. I could get big bucks in there, but to target an individual buck was very difficult because there's so many different spots that he could be in. Where if I would find a property that has, say, it's just as big, but it's got a lot of open space and it's got some really unique points and stuff, there might be only like 5 or 6 spots he's going to be in unless I pressure those. I don't know if any of that makes sense to you, but
yeah, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense.
Another thing I saw that was I related to your stuff was these bedding areas some of them would get a lot of use. Like there'd almost always be a buck in there or two, but it wouldn't always be the same one, And sometimes you'd see a mature buck there one day, and the next day a different one would come in, or you'd see displacement where we had it right over the bed. You'd see a buck come in bed, and another buck come in, and something with dominance, the one would leave and the other one would stay, or the one would stay and the other one would leave again. Like they. Mm-hmm. Whichever one had more dominance, not necessarily the biggest one, but whoever one had more dominance would own the spot if he was there first.
And I have a follow-up question. So while we're talking about the rut and the increase in rut, and, we talk about distance traveled and net displacement. What did the does do in the study? Did you have any does GPS collared? And if you did, what's your experience with doe movement? Are they moving more, the same, less? What's going on with the does during the rut?
We did not. Unfortunately, these types of studies are really, really expensive. And so we just more or less had to sell out and get as many buck collars and bucks sampled as possible. But there will be extreme movements of some does. But from what we have seen, it would not be at near the rate that we see bucks moving around. And so bucks are going to move around a lot more than does, with the exception of a doe's activity patterns are going to increase when she's in estrus. And as a hunter, that makes sense. She's going to move around more. But her home range is typically a lot smaller. She shows a lot more sight fidelity to her home range. And then you'll just see increased activity when the rut comes. Or excuse me, not when the rut comes, when she goes into estrus.
Okay. I want to share. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to follow up with something Dan said, because I think it's so critical, is that the results that we presented are from a southeastern context with our landscape. And so even though our 60,000 acre study area was in more of an agricultural region of Mississippi, it was not in a strict ag region, but it had a lot more agriculture. But there is a surplus of cover. And so when you think of going, if you went from Mississippi and you went north and you start going into Illinois or Iowa, this study area would be the opposite of that. And so there's so many different areas, so many pockets of cover that bucks have choices of where they can bed. I've been to a lot of places in the Midwest where, I call it a cover limited environment. Cover is scarce. And so you can see that there are a lot fewer choices for bucks for refuge and for bedding. And you can see that their fidelity or them going back to those places would be a lot more than what we saw, simply because bedding covers a rare commodity in that environment. So I'm glad you brought that up, Dan. I think that's a really big difference in the South. Is I often say that we are food limited. We're the opposite of the Midwest. We are food limited and cover abundant. And it's just the opposite typically in the Midwest.
That makes sense. I mean, we got a shorter growing season. We don't get as much vegetation. We get a little short window of it. Like our early season's pretty thick. But often I always find that our late season, because we go into winter, we'll have snow. And I mean, all the leaf cover will be gone. A lot of grass will be down. There'll be very limited cover. Everybody quits hunting. And I have some of my very best hunting if I still have a tag at that time of the year, because they are so locked into areas. And then too, because of the cold and snow, they really get on distinct patterns to the food. It'd be interesting to see a study done in this region.
All it takes is some money, Dan.
Yeah.
A lot of it, right?
Yeah. So if you want to start collecting donations, we'll make that happen.
Well,
Right.
While we're talking about the studies, one thing we didn't cover, and it might be interesting to people listening, is what was the age class and like capture method? This is, you mentioned no does. What age class of bucks are we looking at here?
Yeah, when we began, we were hoping every buck would be 4.5 or greater. We were really wanting exclusively mature bucks, but that's not reality. You still have to go the labor of trying to catch these deer. And so we used a combination of some drop nets, but primarily we used dart gun. So it was essentially like bow hunting. And we could have a hunting a trail, hunting a bait site, something like that. And then we have a tranquilizer dart. And so it came hard. I mean, getting those 60 bucks captured, it was a tremendous amount of effort.
And
What age class were you darting?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't answer the question. So we ended up with, generally speaking, about a third of the samples were 5.5 plus. About 20 to 30% were 3.5 and 4.5. And then we had some 2.5-year-olds as well. But more than half of them are going to be 4.5 and 5.5 plus.
I saw a study that you did a while back. I mean, I think it's part of the same study we're talking about, but you had something in there where you had something that made me think that you're talking about 2-year-old bucks, but I think you had them, that it meant that you had them tagged for 2 years or collared for 2 years or something? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't remember that specifically. We did have a couple of these bucks were 2 years. And then they also, the ones that lived and weren't killed or died, they held their collar for 2 years. So if we collared it with a 2-year-old, we had 1 season at 2 and 1 season at 3.
Okay.
And that's something else probably worth mentioning. You mentioned 60,000 area study area. These are wild, free-ranging, non-high fence deer, correct?
You are exactly right. And another very important point here too regarding the response of bucks to pressure is this was private property, a collection or a patchwork of private properties that are all hunted, but compared to hunting pressure on public land, hunting pressure was much, much less on these private properties.
All right, I want to share the screen again here. So this is hourly buck movements by rut phase, and wanted to talk about this because first of all, this is rut specifically, but one of the, I would say, primary methodologies bad, pillar. One of the primary pillars of Dan's tactics is afternoon hunts. And, you can talk about deer being crepuscular or diurnal. They have peaks in the morning and the evening. I think everybody knows that. But I was surprised to see that the morning peak was higher than the afternoon peak. So maybe talk about that a little bit. And then also from a hunting perspective, and we'll be asking you for your opinion here. Would you prefer morning or evening hunts? A lot of times we think it's harder to get into an area in the morning without messing it up. So just give us your thoughts there on both of those.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's look at those data for a moment and hopefully unpack it a little bit. We absolutely, again, with our bucks on this study area, we see that peak around 8 o'clock in the morning, 8 a.m. But keep in mind, if you go to 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m., etc., that is distance by hour. So those bucks are still moving. But think of it this way. Those bucks are moving, but they're not doing very long distance movements. So think of a buck that's navigating the landscape, foraging, for example, looking for acorns, food plot, what have you. And then when you see the spike between 8 and 9 a.m., that is likely because that is where the buck has determined that my rumen is full, my belly is full, I'm going to hightail it and get over to somewhere to cover and bed down. So I don't think that we're seeing a movement spike at that time. I think we're seeing distance covered spike in that time because it's more of a decided movement to cover versus meandering around and foraging. So now, Jeremy, back to your question. I think it all comes down to if you are on a property or a landscape where some of the principles Dan talks about here, where you have got cover located, you have got the highest probability of where bedding is going to be, then you could situate yourselves in between or on the periphery of that cover and catch him coming back. I generally think it's a riskier move, though, because when you're going out as a hunter in the morning, the deer are already out and about. Whereas on the average, when you go out for the afternoon hunt, you're on the move and you're getting settled while the buck is bedded. And then the buck gets on his feet and you're already set up. But both can be successful, but I think it just depends on, do you really know where the bedding area is or not?
So one thing on that, during the rut, I do see a lot of morning movement with good bucks in the AM, and that's a rut portion of the study. It's earlier than rut that I see very little morning movement. What I see is a lot of times if I get up to bedding, it's so quiet that buck's already in there before daylight and he jumps up and runs off. During rut, I'm not seeing it as much. Sometimes I do kick them, and sometimes I see a movement like it's weird. It seems like they bed down at gray light, but get back up at 8 or 9 and move again. Like they're going to look at what the does are doing or something. I don't know. So rut's a little different, but outside of that rut, I have a hard time beating them to the bedroom. And I also have a problem with when they do come in, it's not like the evening. In the evening, and this would be cool to see on your studies. I mean, because I know you can see the pinpoints where they move. I see them come out of the bedding areas with no regard to the wind at all. They go down the main trail that's coming out that you can obviously see with the rubs and the tracks, and you know where to set up. I mean, sometimes there's 3 or 4 of those exits, but you know where they're going to come out, one of these, right? But in the morning, what I find is they tend to seem to want to go downwind of that bedding area and check it. And I don't know if that's something with my area or not. Or another theory we've had with a lot of the southern hunters that are on our forum and that follow the show is there's been some debate with whether the southern deer in early season move more in early or in the AM because of temperatures. We don't have those extreme temperatures up here. Any thoughts on that?
I'm trying to think back if we have a good data slide, Jeremy, we could show for that. I think we do.
Let me scroll through here. We got moon phase, average hourly distance.
It might be with that. Yeah. Yeah. If you go to figure 5, the moon phase graph.
Okay.
If we're using that, so we have day and night movement, total distance traveled. Dan, we really aren't seeing that with our deer.
Okay.
So this would be figure 5 on the left there. The orange line is representing daily distance traveled in yards. And even though the x-axis at the bottom is representing no rut, pre-rut, peak rut, post-rut, those data there begin in September and are going all the way until the end of January. So on the left-hand side of that graph, you're seeing when it's hot down here in September and October.
Okay.
And then you see the big peak there is, as you, of course, would predict, the biggest stimulant of buck movement in our study area is unquestionably the rut. I mean, they're literally doubling or more the ground they are covering in a day.
Well, we're on the moon phase chart. No correlation here, according to the study. Moon phase, so that'd be like full moon, new moon, waxing, waning gibbous, all that fun stuff. One of the questions that I had for you, and it's probably something that hasn't been studied, but in our circle, the people that do believe the moon has some effect on deer movement look more at the overhead and underfoot times, or what some people call like the red moon. I think I already know the answer, but I'm going to ask the question anyways. Has that been evaluated against your data set? And if so, have you found anything?
We had our first team meeting, a couple of us that are looking at those data. We had our first team meeting last week, and we are looking at that very question. I think it would be premature right now for me to give a definitive answer. But I wouldn't hold my breath.
Okay. Sure. Fair enough. And real quick, as a caveat there, we talked about anything new and exciting going on at the MSU Deer Lab before we got online, and maybe talk to us what you're doing now and why with the data set that came out originally.
Yeah, so we're going to do a part 2. And so the publication and all the data and analyses that are shown here and that we're talking about tonight, as soon as we released that and got it out on social media, we just started getting a lot of really, really good feedback of questions that we did not think of. And so we're trying to go through that piece by piece. For example, we're going to examine the bedding questions that we've been talking about, trying to put that more in context, try to provide more context relative to where beds are, what are the habitat conditions or the vegetative conditions around that, even relative to prevailing winds. So maybe some bedding decisions bucks are making, what environmental factors might be influencing that. And then relative to moon phase, the biggest feedback we got was either Ha ha, I knew it. There's nothing to the moon. You guys at MSU Deer Lab are full of crap because they're, I know it. I've seen it. There is absolutely, but the biggest response we got was you need to go one step further with the moon relative to not just phase, but also position. And so that is literally what we're working on now.
Well, that's exciting to hear. Regardless of the result, it'll be nice to have some concrete data from, wild deer that were collared to, see if there's any correlation there at all or not. Let's see. I want to get back to the study, but before I scroll down here, I want to set this up with one of, again, another pillar of Dan's tactics, the hunting beast style tactics, is to look for what Dan calls overlooked spots. So Dan, before I scroll down, I'm not sure if Bronson's familiar with it. Give us an overview of what you would define as an overlooked spot.
What I try to do is I try to look at a property. We have a lot of pressure up here. So, I hunt properties that are, say, like 2,000 acres and have around them, and it'll be like thick, swampy type areas. You might have 150 cars in the perimeter of people hunting there. And I can have one parking lot that'll have, if it's a Saturday, 25 cars, Saturday in rut. So there's a lot of pressure. And what I find is everybody kind of seems to hunt the woods, and I don't see the deer as living in the middle of the woods. I see them as edge creatures, and a lot of people have that figured out. But what I do is I take a look at the map of the property, and I try to figure out where would nobody go, but it still has the habitat that would support deer. So for overlooked areas, I'm looking at spots like between parking lots alongside the road where you can't park. You got to park in a parking lot. Nobody parks in a parking lot, walks alongside the road. Or you have to cross obstacles or something. And I think I get into more bigger animals by hunting those areas. I have a theory that it's because they can smell where people have been, and they can smell it over. Your scent stays there for a long time. So they hang out in areas that don't smell like people, but that's basically the overlooked theory.
Okay, so I'm going to scroll down here, and one of the figures, which I thought kind of was very interesting, and we're going to look at both of these, but I'll zoom in a little bit first. Let's talk about focal areas. And for people that can't see the caption here, I will read the caption. We're going to look at the graph on the left, or the satellite image. So this is buck 277. It's a 3.5-year-old buck, and the date range is December 20th to 26th, which I believe, but correct me if I'm wrong here, Dr. Strickland, that's still during the rut for your area. And the figure 10 caption is, this buck had 10 focal areas over a 1-week period during the rut, but he clearly preferred some over others. His favorite focal areas appear to be in secluded islands of cover where he feels safe from hunting pressure. And before I turn it over to you, I think early on in my hunting career, don't ask me where I got this idea. It was an ill-informed idea, but I thought I needed to be like in the center of the timber, right? So if I'm looking at this as me 15 years ago, all the spots that I would have went are like here, 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 all the areas that are devoid of deer movement. So talk to us about your observations, these focal areas, and why you think the deer end up in these type of areas.
Well, hey, that's a really good question, and that has really prompted us to do more digging and trying to find out what are these spatial and landscape characteristics that are more often associated with where we're seeing these buck bedding areas. But I simply think they're strategic locations. I think, as Dan mentioned, there's probably not as much of a human footprint or a signature of humans being there a lot. I think it's also strategic regarding using all of the buck's senses, so vision, hearing, and smell. And when you look at some of these spots, let's go to the very southern part there where we have 1, 2, and 4 visits. I don't know how you're going to get in. Let's just say you wanted to try to walk in on that buck and shoot it with a rifle. I don't know how you're going to do that.
Can I interrupt you real quick? Do you happen to know what, if there was a crop in this field at the time and what it was? I know I'm asking a lot there.
This would have been in December. So I do not think so. It is possible in my neck of the woods down here that it could have been a cover crop, but most likely it was fallow.
And then one more quick question. What's typically in the study area, what's the prevailing wind or winds?
Either out of the north or out of the south.
Okay. And yeah, so go ahead, and then I'll ask, or I'll tell you why I asked those questions in a minute.
Yeah, well, I think I was just wrapping up there that even for us looking there, in this case, primarily vision, if you're on that more southerly spot there, it's just going to be very difficult for a predator, or in this case, a human or a hunter, to be able to approach and kill that buck. It's going to be difficult to get in there. Then if you move north into that bigger timbered part, you notice we're typically on edges there where we're bedded. And so I'm just thinking, and this is what we want to go through all of the data and input the wind and look at things like that to figure out if it is ideally located to where there's either a barrier to the buck's side or back, but where it can utilize both sense of smell and then also vision so that it can feel protected.
Yeah, and I want to turn it over to Dan. Dan, explain your own observations of farm country bedding and how the wind, and especially with a field that's likely harvested here, so no ag cover like corn or something.
Well, what I see is them bedding on the points. Like if you look at the 4 visits that's right underneath the big woods, like you'd see them on that tip when you have like say a westerly wind, but that's not to say they wouldn't be there in a, north or south either, and just change the rotation. But we'd see points, and I've actually visually watched deer get up and move. I mean, very short distances around a point. They keep the wind to their back and look downhill, or to look out at an opening, but be able to smell behind them. And I tend to think that when they're on edges, they have that wind to their back and they're watching the edge. And that's been a lot of the farm country stuff that we've hunted is like that. But as soon as you get into the woods and you get into thick cover, they could be bedding for a different reason. You can find beds that are like more sound-based, where they can hear you coming. They always seem to have some sort of protective factor, whether it's the cover so thick that they're going to hear you coming up to them, or they have that edge where they can see you. And another thing too, while we're on this subject, is I've had a tendency to notice an awful lot of beds that like watch where hunters access from. And I wonder if you've ever seen any of that, and like it shows up on your data, like where people walk or overseeing it. Do you ever see any of that?
No, Dan, but we haven't looked for it either. And I guess I would also say that even for some of the study where we were also tracking the hunters as well, just because of the, relatively speaking, the low number of hunters relative to the big area, I don't know if we would have as many of those patterns, with the exception of, I have no idea if it's like this in the Midwest, but most of the hunting is done on food plots. So I could easily see where a buck would monitor, the parking lot, the food plot, and how the hunter is going to navigate in between. I could see that being strategic for a buck.
Sure. Yeah. And now that you say that, a lot of the observations that I'm remembering were on farms, like watching the access on farms and near farm plots. And what we have for fields up here are not like what you're used to. I mean, a 200-acre farm is huge, where, you're used to 50,000-acre ranches. We don't have anything like that up here. Everything is broken down so small that the fields are really small, almost food plot size. And most of the private lands do have food plots on them, just like you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking about, we're going to look at this bedding figure also to the right. But before we do that, because this is probably important and it's a good place to go there, I'm going to scroll down, and I think I saw a picture in here, but let's talk about screening cover a little bit. What is it? How did you measure it in the study? And maybe that's one of the things you're looking at. Here we go. Here's the screening cover.
Yeah. So what we did for that was way back when we started noticing, we were picking up the footprint or the signature of the data that during the middle of the day, for example, when we're getting this cluster of points, we're determining that's got to be a bed. That's got to be where the buck is bedding. So we just wanted to determine what are the vegetative characteristics that are most commonly found around these buck beds. And excuse me, experimentally, what we would have to do is go into that area where the bed was, and using that instrument that you're seeing there with the arrow pointed to it in the A panel, it's called a NUDS board. And it is just a way to determine visual screening. And so what you'll have to do, what you do there is you'll have someone holding that board up, and then an observer will be X amount of distance away that you standardize, and you count how many of those squares you can see. And so that just gives you a quantitative way to say what the screening cover was. So you've got the same person with the same instrument, that NUDS board, in figure A as you do in figure B.
Yeah, it's hard to even see it in figure B. I mean, it's right here if people are looking. It's kind of hard to see, though.
So total concealment like that. And so what we did is we went to the place where the buck was bedded, and then we'd use a random number generator and just figure out a direction and a distance. And we would go out for that. And, what are random places on the landscape associated with that bedding area? What does it look like? And so then you can see there that bar graph there is that in the used areas, there was a minimum of 2 times as much screening cover as if you just randomly went to Google Earth and put your finger down on the map. Then that is what you'd see there, about 15% cover versus where bucks were at approaching 35% screening cover.
Is it safe to say screening cover in stem count, are those synonymous, higher stem count?
Yes, they would, but you could still have greater screening cover with not a great amount of stem count, just depending on the type of vegetation that is in your area. So for us, it didn't matter if it was blackberry, if it's briars, if it's vine, if it's a high density of stems, a high density of grass. The bottom line was that the buck could go in there and lay down and be concealed.
Okay. And I want to go back now to the bedding. So if you're not familiar with Dan, and I don't know, because you guys haven't spoken before, I don't know how familiar you are with Dan's tactics and the bedding centric focus, but this is a great figure here. I'm looking at figure 11 now. And for people that can't read this, I'll zoom in a little more, but the yellow is bedding, the blue is feeding / tending, and the green is walking. So Dr. Strickland, first, I'd like you to kind of explain that they're kind of self-evident, but explain those in the context of the GPS collars. And then we want to look at specifically, because a lot of our audience is interested in the bedding, these bedding clusters and what those might mean to you.
Sure. So it may sound ridiculous. Someone may say, well, why don't you just follow every buck every day and look at it and get your pencil and your clipboard out and mark down the places where it looks like it's bedded or it looks like it's moving? When you have so much data, so literally in this data set, we have over 1 million observations. It would take you months and months and months for a person to do something like that. So very, very smart people, not me, really smart people can go in and look at what they kind of call the behavior of the movement. And that is relative to from point 1 to point 2. They look at the angle that the buck took, and they look at the distance. And when you do that over and over and over, you are able to discriminate the buck into 3 distinct behaviors based on the complexity of the angles that they're taking and the distance in between the points. And they were bedded, they were foraging or tending, as in tending a doe, and then walking or moving. So for example, what the algorithm or the program would pick out, if you have a point 1 and point 2, and there's very little difference in the angle that it moved and it went a long distance, the computer algorithm would classify the behavior of that buck at that time as walking or moving. And then just the opposite for bedded. So that was just a way that we could write a program and go through 1 million data points.
Sure.
And for every one of those points, classify the behavior the buck was in.
So something going back to Dan's tactics, and this gets confused, but Dan, talk about, I think maybe the misconception of hunting a specific bed versus a bedding area, and kind of what you were talking about, optimizing for certain times of year. And Dan, I think obviously you're good at this. Talk about some of the things that you look for when you're doing your spring or off-season scouting in these bedding areas that are clues that might clue you in when that optimal time frame is. And then we'll hear from Dr. Strickland if he agrees or disagrees and why.
Okay, I can try and answer that, but it sounded like about 15 questions. But
sure.
A lot of people talk about hunting a singular bed, and I think that's a big waste of time. Probably 95% of the time. Usually it's areas, and the area can be, from, in areas that don't have a lot of cover. It can be a 1/4 acre, but it could be as big as 5 acres, where that buck will have a tendency to bed at a certain time of year. And what I look for is anything that's going to tell me a time frame, like a bedding area that's really ripped up with rubs. I would say that they're probably bedding there close to pre-rut, when they're really worked up. Earlier in the season, they don't. And what'll fool people a lot is those bedding areas, those beds will have a lot of wear in them, look like they're used all the time. And they're really not. I think a deer laying there for a few hours does a lot of damage to the, and really makes a mark. So some of the things I look for, like there was a buck that I hunted for quite a few years in a big marsh, cattail marsh, where he lived in this cattail marsh. And he bedded in this cattail marsh, and it was pretty random. I mean, he had bedding areas, but a lot of them and a lot of spots he could be in, and it was all cattails. There's like 2 spots where I had trees I could hunt out of, and on the ground, the cattails are over your head. I have a hard time shooting, and I was really trying to find some way to kill this deer. He was the last year I hunted him, he was 7.5, and I kept going back, and it bothered me. There's got to be some way to get at this thing. And my big thing about scouting is to go in spring right after the snow melts and get in there while you can still see the sign from season and still read it fairly well. And that might not be as much an option down by you, Bronson, but anywho, I got back there and really searched one day, and I know the area intimately, but I came up to a spot that I had been to before but hadn't put it together. Let's say it's in this ocean of cattails that's for miles in the area where this buck is hanging, where I was getting trail cam pictures of him and such. And this spot, there's a little bit of elevation change. You couldn't see it on a topo. You couldn't even see it on an aerial, but there's like a foot higher of ground that came up out of the water in the cattails. And it was grassy, but it had willow brush on it that you really couldn't see from an aerial. It kind of blended in with the cattails. This willow brush was like like head high, and up here that stuff loses its leaves in early October. And in this willow brush was probably like 50 different beds that were worn to the ground. And all this willow brush was torn up, rubbed. And when I looked at that, I thought, this deer is not laying there in the sun, later in the year. He's laying there when that willow brush has cover. And, the rubs were really dull and faded. We're usually right after the season in January, February. If they were used, done in rut, our rut up here, they're still real orange, when the bark's stripped, telling me they're earlier season rubs. And you could see it was a yearly pattern. And I just assumed that buck had to be bedding there when our season opens in early September, between that, when they have antlers, which is early September, to when those leaves fell down, which is not that many weeks, and to put down that much bedding, in that time frame, he had to be there a lot during that time frame. So that's what I determined. And then what I did was I followed the exit trail from the bedding, which was one real heavy trail that it went up towards private land. And where it came up out of the cattails, there was a spot that was probably 20, 30 yards onto the public that had one tree about this big around that had some brush around it that you could get a stand about 8 or 10 feet off the ground. And I ended up, the first year I hunted that, the first time I hunted it, something got up in that bedding area and was coming to me, and a doe got up real close and came up to me and spooked. And then I left the place alone for the whole rest of the year, not wanting to spook the deer out. I think I gave it one more hunt just in case, but it spooked the deer that was coming when the doe spooked, and I never saw it. The next year I went in there again, the first day of the season that we had the right wind. And I had the same thing, something get up in that red brush. You can't see it because the cattails are actually like 10 feet tall, and come in, and it turned out to be the buck I was hunting, and I shot him. And I've got an array of stories like that, but it gets you into the mindset of how I do that. But if a guy like finds those rubs and stuff and doesn't read it right and says, well, I'm saving that for rut, that deer's long gone. You gotta get a timing thing down. And one thing I noticed too was like you had these roamer bucks, and that really hit home with me because a lot of what I'm seeing is you'll see a buck that you hunt all season. He hops around in these bedding areas, and you'll have one that is in an area for like 2 weeks out of the season. He's gone. You never see him again the whole rest of the year, and you wonder what happened to him. And there's one deer in particular, a buck that was living on a private ranch that has managed hunts, but it took me a few years of hunting him, where he'd come across the road, but it'd be after dark or whatever, and you kind of watch him. And right around pre-rut, about a week or so, he'd come over in daylight. But I saw a pattern over a 3-year period where he always ended up in the same bedding area right in that week, right around Halloween. And once I had that down and I figured that out, I shot the buck on Halloween day, the first time I hunted him. I waited till the sign showed up that he was there. And so it's not really this random hunting that people think, like you find a bed and you hunt over it. And I see a lot of young guys look at what I'm doing and think they can just go out and find a bed, and they'll send you a picture and be like, hey, I got it. I'm going to kill this buck this year. And it's like they don't even realize how much work and thought goes into that.
Yeah. Yeah. That is excellent woodsmanship. I mean, I think focusing on those details like you described, that is really, really interesting. And it makes perfect sense to me. An example that you see here, I am pretty sure, if you notice that image in front of you, notice that there's some excursions, but notice that there's a higher density of bedding and movement on the north side of that graph. And then it kind of feathers out, and there's a lot more movement to the southern part of that graph. Do you see the border right there? There's this distinct line where that buck is not crossing.
Yeah.
And that's a river. Mm. So he is nestled in kind of parallel in this region here, of course, adjacent to these rivers. That is where we're going to have cover. When you get more into the uplands, that's where we're going to have a patchwork of agriculture and fields and so forth. But then that is just an area right there that buck is concentrating a lot of his movements as well as a lot of his bedding. But if you, Dan, to your point, if you were just to sell out and find one of those beds, best of luck to you. I mean, you're probably going to strike out. It's going to take a lot of homework, not necessarily finding a bed, but if you zoom in there, you can see that there's clusters of those beds. And so definitely some tendencies for where that buck is hanging out. So it takes a lot of homework to figure that out.
And a lot of luck. I mean, it's like the skill and the luck have to collide for it to work.
And what's really weird, we've been talking about these borders too, and I always say deer are individuals. I mean, we say, most of them behave this way, but there's always exceptions. We talked about in this publication, most of these bucks are sedentary, meaning they have that home range that everybody thinks of as just this big area and the buck's always there. And then we have what we call these mobile bucks, meaning, Dan, you were talking about a movement, all of a sudden a shift. And so we have about a third of these bucks spend a part of the year in one area, and then they have a distinctly different, non-overlapping home range that they go. And y'all may have seen some of our stuff on social media. This was an extreme example, not normal. But we had a buck with remarkable timing every year, would leave Mississippi, swim the Mississippi River, and go spend the summer in Louisiana.
That's actually for people that are watching, that is the buck in the thumbnail, not the one Bronson's holding, but the one in the background. And I had read that, so I purposely picked that one out for the thumbnail. Talk about how wide the Mississippi River is there.
About a mile.
Yeah.
It's going to depend on flood stage and flow and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, some of those places that can be a mile wide. And so that is a feat in and of itself. How often deer do that? We don't know. Maybe does do it as well. We really don't know. But we know that one of our bucks did that, and with remarkable regularity, meaning that around February, into February, he would move from his Mississippi hunting season home range. He would take an excursion over to the river. It took him about a day to think about it, get up the courage. And then he would swim the river. And then he would spend 3 or 4 months in Louisiana. And about August, he would do the same thing, go to the river, stage up for a day, swim the Mississippi, and then go to his Mississippi home range. And he did that 2 years in a row. He may have been doing that his whole life. We were only able to monitor him for 2 years. So that's just an extreme example of what some of these bucks are doing. And so, Dan, it's one of those things, too, that years ago when people that are running a bunch of cameras would always say, I don't know what it is, but come October 15 or around November 17, but there would always be this distinct couple of days or up to a week. Yep. This buck either shows up or this buck is gone. And the GPS data are confirming that about a third of the bucks are doing that. They just pick up and move. And you may ask why. We have no idea.
I'll read this, the figure 15, which talks about home range size here. The caption says, annual home range size varied dramatically among adult bucks. The median value was 859 acres, but 27% occupied less than 500 acres. And those are the ones in the study you're calling sedentary. And 22% occupied more than 2,000 acres. And those are, I forget, what was the term? Mobile bucks.
Mobile.
Yeah. I want to go back to so we're coming up on an hour, and I want to be respectful of your time. So we had more questions, but we're going to trim it down here so we can get to some questions from the chat. But one more question before we wrap up. One of the tactics, and this isn't a common, but it's a sometimes used tactic for people that follow Dan's ideas, is something called stacking. So Dan, talk about stacking, what it is, and then Bronson, let us know if you think that could work and why.
Okay, I'll give an example of it because I think that gets the image better.
Dan, Dan, let me interrupt you real quick. Right here, with Bronson was talking about clusters. In this specific buck, there's like 4 clusters. So maybe talk about how, if you knew about these 4 primary bedding areas, how you would go about it. Let's do that.
Okay. So I would hunt these bedding areas down in a row if I thought the buck was in the area. And I wouldn't be shy about my scent or anything else. I go in there, I hunt it. If I get them, I get them. If I don't, I don't. I go on to the next one. And I feel that my chances increase as I move because that buck's going to keep staying away from the areas I've been. They seem to tolerate me if I'm by a food source. They might get a little later. They might be a little more sneaky. They don't tolerate you much, but they tolerate you a lot more than if you get by bedding. They seem to freak out if they see you in your bedding. So when I push the limits and I'm hunting, say within that 100 yards of bedding and thick cover, I'm sneaking in there and setting up. I think if that deer isn't there when I'm there and he does come back, he's not hanging around. He's going to smell that I was there near his trail, and he's going to boogie out of there. And then there's only so many other places you can hunt if you're in an area that has limited bedding. And if I hunt that down on a regular basis and hunt my way through there, kind of work through it, I kind of believe, but by the time I get to the last beds, I'm probably having a better hunt than at the beginning, because I'm pushing that deer kind of into these areas. Like when you look at that map you just shown, you could see like 4 or 5 distinct areas where it looked like he was probably bedding quite often. Now, hitting that on the exact day is hard, but if you hit that and you don't get them, and I wouldn't just, like some of those areas, I wouldn't just hunt one spot. I'd have several spot exits coming through those.
Uh-oh. Looks like we lost.
If that's a different story, but I'm probably going to run across.
Dan, we lost you just for 1 second. So repeat maybe the last 20 seconds.
I said if I hunt around the perimeters of those bedding areas, and if you look at that, there's probably only 4 or 5 real, distinct areas. I'm probably going to run across that deer before I'm done. Whether I kill him or not is a different story, but I'll probably at least run across them. If I indeed know where those spots are, if I've done my homework, which is a big part of it.
Yeah, and then Dr. Strickland, and the reason I wanted to bring this up in this stacking approach is I wanted to close out today, and hopefully you'll join us again in the future, because we had more questions, but we're just, we're running up on an hour. Can you talk about what you saw? You said you didn't track that many hunters, but you did track some, and you did have some findings on hunting pressure. So can you talk in the context maybe of what Dan was talking about, hunting pressure, what you saw with the deer, and how long in the absence of hunting pressure it took the deer to get back to like baseline activity?
Yeah, I'll have to combine a couple different studies to answer that question. What we essentially saw is that we did not see any measurable shifts in the types of areas when you're classifying areas based on vegetation type or vegetation cover. So quite simply, again, down here in this landscape, hardwood areas or wetland areas or pine forest areas or agriculture. So when hunting pressure began, so we recorded number of hunters, number of hours, etc., and we broke that down into a low pressure, an average pressure, high pressure days, hunting pressure days. We didn't really see a shift to where bucks gravitated toward a different type of vegetation. What we did see is that them starting to show up when they started moving, and particularly when they were showing up at food plots, it would be later and later. So that's what we saw with this study. Now, when we combine that with a study Steve was a part of 10 years before this in Oklahoma, it was a different study design. With that study design, they had their study area broken into, also with GPS collared bucks, it was broken into a no hunting area, a low pressure area, so they could dictate how many hunters went in, how long they could hunt, etc., and then a high pressure area. And what they noted is that in these high pressure areas, it took about 3 or 4 or 5 days of when deer are detecting sound, smell, hearing, etc., confrontations with hunters, they started changing their behavior. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't so much that it was this shift to where they went completely nocturnal or something like that. It changed their movement behavior, meaning they were no longer taking these long distance walks through the woods. Instead, they were taking these very decided, the term we use is tortuous, just very tight turning angles. They were meandering and navigating at a much smaller scale. So they might cover a long distance, but they're not doing it where they're exposing themselves over a wide area where a hunter would see them. Coincidentally here too, or something that could contribute, Auburn University did a great study too, looking at recovery time. I thought this is a great study. they went into places where hunters had been, mainly stands associated with food plots, and they were tracking where bucks got near these hunters all over the landscape. And what they determined is that after a buck had had a hunter encounter in one of these areas, it would take 4 or 5 or 6 days before that buck would start using that area where the hunter was at. So it took that many days for it to cool down, no human scent, no voices, etc., no more encounters, and they would start using it again. So hopefully, Jeremy, putting all that together maybe answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. And again, just because I'm not sure how familiar you are with the tactics that Dan teaches, but the main pillar, I would say, well, the two main pillars are hunting near bedding areas and mobility, where very rarely, if ever, even in the same season, are you looking to hunt the same specific stand site. Like Dan said, you might hunt a tree 200, 300, 500 yards away in the same bedding area, or that proximity if there's a good buck in there, but to avoid that exact area. And for that reason, I mean, anecdotally, right, we've learned over the years without GPS that it doesn't take long to booger an area up, and it takes quite a while for the deer to get back to baseline.
And Dan, I guess what you're talking about with stacking, it's kind of accomplished another way. If you're in an area where there's a lot of hunters, you aren't disturbing all of those bedding spots. Other hunters are. So if you're able to find the area that's furthest away, or the place that's more secluded, or where there's the least amount of human interaction, you're not doing it, but other hunters are doing it for you.
Yeah, I've used it in both ways. I mean, a lot of the places I go, the big bucks are bedding there because people don't go there. There's some reason that's keeping people out, the overlook thing or whatever. But the example I was going to give earlier was exactly what you're saying. There's a marsh I hunt that I hunted about 20 years ago that I had really great success on. It was all grass, and then it went down into a bowl of cattails and water, and the edge of that bowl was timbered, but only for like 30 yards, say, and it had little fingers going into the cattails, and the deer would bed along that edge, and there was nothing really distinct, and it was pretty random, and it was really hard to get a grasp on these deer. But in the center of those cattails was a little oak island that had a point coming off of it that had really good bedding on it, really good cover, better than anything around the rim, and it was always a good spot. But over time, I figured out that if I waited till pheasant season opened and that grass just completely filled up with dogs and hunters, and it'd be a pretty heavy load of hunters because they plant pheasants there. They'd release them for hunters. They would get into that little line of trees because it was so thin that they would push those deer to that island because they're not going to bed in the water in between.
Yeah.
But what I found too is if I was over eager and I went out there, say opening day of pheasant or the next day, I wouldn't do all that well. But if I waited like 2 or 3 days into it, where those guys have 2 or 3 days of pounding that edge, that island would be on fire, and I'd always get a chance at something big. And then over time, I tried something where outside of that pheasant season, I'd go and I'd walk that perimeter right on the edge of the cattails where the beds normally are, and I'd just walk it myself and walk it a couple days in a row, and then go hunt the island and get almost the same effect. Not quite as good as having 100 people do it, but
yeah,
get a similar effect.
Using hunting pressure to your advantage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're going to bring Ashley back on. So let me make sure this is working. And Ashley, when you're ready, come on. I can see your icon, but I can't see her yet. So make sure your camera's on. And while we're waiting for Ashley to get on, we're going to tomorrow, for the first time, we're going to do a members only live stream. We're going to talk about a property that Dan used to hunt, break it down, do some mapping and some things like that. So for members only, special live stream tomorrow. If you want to join, it'll be the same time, 7 Central. And I think I see Ashley coming back.
We can also do a drawing for that bow I'm giving away.
You're going to do that tomorrow too, the drawing?
Yeah. Everybody already put their numbers in. So.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Too late to put my name in the hat for the bow?
Go for it.
Yeah. Ashley, can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
No, can't hear you.
Oh,
Are you muted? Well, Ashley, I don't know what it is about this program. We have this problem sometimes. So while Ashley's getting unmuted, I will go ahead and ask a few questions. There are a preponderance of questions today, so we'll see. And hopefully we don't run into some of these same ones twice. So, we kind of covered this, but I'll ask it again. And you gave the example of the deer going from Mississippi to Louisiana. And maybe if you've noticed it in any other of the study bucks, have you noticed the same time, same place on bucks from year to year? So of those bucks that are more mobile, are they randomly mobile, or are they on like a pattern, same 10 or 100 acres, the first week in November, year to year, or is it more random?
So within an individual buck, if they demonstrate this behavior, they are typically doing it at around the same time and going to the same area. But there is no particular time where all of these mobile bucks are doing these shifts. Some of them are doing it early in the season, some mid-season, some late season, some springtime. So there was no pattern regarding when they do it, but there is an individual pattern that if they do it with regularity from year to year.
Interesting. We got another question from Pharrell. It says, what are some different types of antler restrictions, and which of those different restrictions are more successful? Any experience there, or any research you've done on antler point restrictions?
Yeah, we've done a lot of research with antler restrictions. Essentially, the antler restrictions that are going to allow bucks to get as old as possible are the most effective. Let me give you a real simple example. In Mississippi, for years, this goes back into the 90s, we have a 4-point rule. And for a buck, once it got 4 total points, it was legal for harvest. And there was extreme pressure. So many of those bucks were being harvested. The problem is that some of those 4-pointers were also yearlings. And so because of that antler restriction, we were also taking some of the very best young bucks, and some of the older bucks that had 2 or 3 points were allowed to live. And so it promoted a term that we call high grading, where we're taking the very best of an age class and allowing the smaller antler size of an age class to live. Now, none of that has any genetic implications whatsoever. It just means that over time, you start 2, 3, and 4-year-old bucks. This antler restriction is an age restriction. Okay. Only shoot 3-year-old, 3.5 plus, 4.5 plus, because anytime you set a limit of X amount of points, X amount of beam length, the problem is that there are some young bucks that have above average antlers and they get harvested.
No, that's a good point. I appreciate the information there. Ashley, I think we can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. So go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. I don't know what question you asked, but the first question.
Antler point restrictions.
Okay, so the first one I have is from Continental Content. It says, "Do you notice same time, same place on bucks from year to year?"
Oh, sorry.
November 2nd, same straight year.
Skip that one. I that was the other one I asked while you were off. So skip that one.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Steve Denoyer said, "Dr. Strickland, what's the best management tool a state agency DNR can use to get as close as possible to a balanced age and herd structure?"
That's a really good question. Probably won't be a very popular answer here, It's probably limiting opportunity. The longer, and this is a big difference in the history and the culture of Southern deer hunting versus the Midwest. We've got a 3-month rifle season. Our bow season begins in October and deer season ends January 31st. And then we've got November, December, January for rifle hunting. And so you're really asking a lot for a lot of your bucks to live through that number of months when you have heavy hunting pressure. But that's a balance too, because you want your hunters to be successful. You want them to buy a hunting license. And so you kind of have to set those limits to where that is culturally acceptable in the area that you hunt. But the surefire way that you can improve buck survivability, it would be to limit the number of days you can chase bucks with a gun, or a rifle. And then in terms of getting sex ratio more even, it is increasing the number of days that you can harvest does. And so, for example, in most of the South, when deer season begins, doe season begins. You can harvest them all throughout the year.
Alrighty, so our next question is from Matthew Bell. He says, how much of a correlation do you see between lower deer densities and an increase in rut activity?
I would answer that question. I think it's less about a lower deer density and more about sex ratio. And so the more bucks that you have per doe, the more competition that you're going to have. I think that's where your spot's in the rut. So if you have a deer to 10 acres or a deer to 100 acres, I don't think that is going to affect rut intensity as much as the ratio of bucks to does.
Might have had Ashley drop off again. So that's interesting. And that's been my personal experience. I've hunted quite a few different places throughout the country, and places like Kansas versus a Michigan, where Michigan has tons of antlerless deer and not a very good mature buck age structure. I don't know the exact numbers, but it might be as bad as 10-1 in some areas where you got 1 buck for every 10 does, versus a Kansas where it's much closer to 1-2. And yeah, you've got a much more visible, pronounced, intense rut, in my opinion, where that's balanced. And something we didn't get a chance to talk to, but it's interesting reading for people that might want to know, is in that same study, or maybe it was a different one. I read quite a bit of stuff in preparation for this, but talked about how changing the age structure could actually impact the peak of the rut. So I guess if you got a second while we're waiting for Ashley to jump back on, maybe talk about that. I think it was the age structure and the nutrition and environment could both impact peak rut dates. How's that work?
Yeah, it's more about, again, more about sex ratio than probably buck age structure. But this may be difficult to describe. It's one of those where you need a chalkboard or a graph and you can really explain it. But the bottom line is that most of your does are going to come into estrus the same time every year. The issue is, will a majority, if not all, of those does be bred during their first estrus? So here's an example. Jeremy, you were saying a sex ratio, which that'd be really, really difficult to have a 10-1, but let's just say it's 10-1. Then you can have a scenario that when the peak of the rut or the peak of estrus, you've got so many does on the landscape during a 5, 10, 15-day period that are in estrus that you don't have enough bucks to breed them while they're in estrus. And so then they go out of estrus and they come into estrus 28 days later. And so that would be, a perceived as a second rut. But all you have to do in that situation is if the adult buck to doe ratio is more even, all of those does get bred during their first estrus cycle. So that's the way it is. Now, there's one caveat here. What you will often see for this second little rut or trickle rut or things like that are really young does. It may be the yearling does, and if you're in a great place and you have fawn breeding, doe fawns are coming into heat, they will generally be about a month or so later. So that second little bump you see in breeding activity later, that's typically young does coming into heat.
That's interesting. And I think in some of the reading, you talked about like I talked to Dwayne Diefenbach from Penn State about this too, but basically critical mass. So a lot of the doe fawn, that's directly proportional to body weight, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Her body weight as well as her fat accumulation. Yes.
We got another question from Pharrell. It says, can you talk to us a little on how deer see and what makes them decide to disregard what they think they might see? So maybe deer vision in general.
Admittedly, that is not my forte. That is not my research background. They see color very differently than we see color. And so over time, they evolved to see part of the color spectrum that affects their lives in the most sensitive way. So they see spectrums of light that are going to help them find food, avoid predators, etc. And it's completely different from us. So they're not seeing the intensity of colors like we see. They see different spectrums of light that probably are helping them see a little bit better at night and during these crepuscular periods. But honestly, I really can't get into the physiology of a deer's eye. That hadn't been my research.
Yeah, we did allow you to say in preparation for this, I don't know. So you're allowed to say, I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah. Ashley, we had a question about deer vision, and that was all I asked. So go ahead with your next one.
Oh, that's the only one you asked? Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Where were we? Pharrell had one. It said, what are some different types of antler restrictions, and which of those different restrictions
Oh, I lied.
are more successful based on particular
we did ask that one too. I'm sorry. That's my fault.
Okay, you're good.
Hey, Ashley and Jeremy, let me say something about that, please.
Sure.
We have that's a very good question. Very good question. And very much like this buck movement publication we talked about tonight, Steve Damaris and I created a very similar publication about antler restrictions. So if you go to our website, we've got a 20 or 30 page publication for the person that asked the question. Please go to our website. We've got everything you want to know and more about the pros, cons, good, bad, and ugly of antler restrictions.
Yeah, and for people that are watching, I already put a link to the main MSU Deer Lab website. And if you go under publications on the website, you can find these additional studies.
So the next one was from Matthew Bell, and he said, are there any collared bucks that travel together year round, including during the rut?
I would not be surprised to find out if that happens. All I can say with our data, with the 60 bucks that we have, we did not see that. Now, that does not mean that during the summertime, post antler cast, when they're in bachelor groups, sure, we could see it then. But once they're into hard antler, they were getting their own home range, and we never saw that behavior.
Farrell is wondering, what is the doe fidelity data like, max, minimum, and mean?
On the studies that I'm familiar with, there, of course, is a relationship to habitat quality, landscape configuration, etc. Some of the doe home ranges can be really, really, really small in terms of a seasonal home range that may be 100 acres or certainly a couple hundred acres. So there's just a really, really big difference between does and bucks. But at the same time, If you're in a fragmented landscape, if you're in a landscape with lesser habitat quality or food is distributed far over the landscape, you could easily have a doe that has a home range of 500, 600, or 700 acres.
Alrighty, the next one is also from Farrell. He said, how well would you expect the MSU study to correlate to deer in eastern Texas, like east of Huntsville?
I think it would correlate very well to eastern Texas. I don't think it would correlate very well in southern Texas. Completely different landscape, completely different environment.
Again, Matthew Bell, he says, how much did the deer disperse after being collared? Do they avoid that area afterward?
Most of them did not. Most of them, of course, after we sedate them, we put the collar on and then we give them a reversal drug. Most of them went up and about, and we did not notice really any big difference. In other words, they stayed in their home range, with the exception of one buck. We had one buck after he was collared. The very next day or maybe 2 days later, he went 11 miles or 12 miles.
He's out of there.
So, well, we're never going to see that guy back here again. This was what was amazing about it. It just so happened when we captured that buck and put a collar on it, it was also one of those mobile bucks that he was getting ready to disperse and have a home range shift anyway, because the very next year at the exact same time, he showed the exact same dispersal pattern.
Oh, wow.
So we just happened to put a collar on him right before he dispersed.
Pretty interesting.
That's wild.
Yeah.
I thought he'd been abducted by aliens
Yeah.
and he ran away.
Right.
Chad Goldstein asked, Dr. Strickland, CWD, and your thoughts.
How many hours do you have? That's a really tough question. I'll try to be as brief as possible. It's not fake. It's real. It's not a money grab. It's not a scare tactic. CWD is a real thing. CWD is 100% fatal. It will 100% kill deer. The issue, to me, there's no debate. There is no debate about that at all. The debate lies in what do we do about it? And that is where we may be years away before we figure out a management strategy that is effective on the biological side, but also effective on the landowner hunter side as well. And so I think that's where we see the problems with so many people not accepting CWD and CWD management is the short-term effects of lowering deer density, the short-term effects of if you're in the South, if you're in a CWD management zone, you can no longer supplementally feed or you can no longer bait. That has a very immediate and tangible difference to you and the way you hunt. So again, we could talk a long time about this, but the bottom line is that it's real. It's in our future. This is something hunters and biologists, et cetera, we're going to come together about this and find solutions that work for all of us. If you go to our MSU Deer Lab YouTube channel, we actually developed a series of 12 or 13 or 14 very simple videos explaining CWD, from the biology, the ecology, the disease aspect of it, the impacts to people, to managers, etc. So if you really want to learn more about that in video format versus having to read a lot of literature online, I just invite you to go look at our CWD videos on the MSU Deer Lab YouTube channel.
Alrighty, so next question is, do you know how many deer per square mile is in Dan's area versus the MSU study, or does anyone know?
I think I have about 25 per square mile, I think is what they're saying right now.
That's wild. All right, the next one is Brian Griggs. He said, Dr. Strickland, how is a study like this funded?
A study like this is funded initially by the interest of hunters and landowners, and hunters and landowners working with and interacting with their state wildlife agency. In my case, that's the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks, our state wildlife agency. The state wildlife agency interacting with those hunters and hearing, where did our bucks go? We're seeing all these bucks up until November and they're gone. Are they nocturnal? Are they leaving? Are they swimming the Mississippi River? Et cetera, et cetera. And that is what prompted MDWFMP, our state agency, to work with the MSU Deer Lab to conduct this study. So that is where financially it came from. Now, you could be in another part of the country. For example, you may be in Texas, where you have a different types of budgets from landowners, and you might have a landowner that completely funds a study like this. But in our case, it was funded by our state wildlife agency. And we are grateful to them for doing that.
All right, so we got a couple more. This one's a good one. Matthew Bell said, is there any specific bedding location that was strange, unexpected, unique, or memorable?
Jeremy, that came in and out for me. Could you repeat that question?
Sure. And during the course of the study, was there any bedding areas that were strange, unique, or memorable?
Not that I can recall. There were a lot of different areas all over the landscape, but none really stand out to me as I wouldn't have guessed that. Maybe one. There was one that I thought that was pretty smart, and it was from a younger buck, was a fence row that evidently the landowner or producer had not sprayed glyphosate on that fence row that year. And that buck found a little pocket on that fence row, and maybe there was a little sumac bush or a little plum bush or something right there. But he went to that one little spot several times.
Interesting. Ashley, let's do one more, and then we'll probably wrap it up there for today. And but before we do that, I want to extend a sincere thanks to Dr. Strickland for coming on. Like I said, it's always great to get hard data from, like these GPS collar surveys, and it's not anecdote, it's unbiased data, and I'm a big fan of that. So I want to say thanks to you. Dan, give you a minute to say any last words for this last question here.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. I'm fascinated about your study too. Whenever I listen to hunting podcasts, I always have this little doubt. You kind of wonder if somebody knows what they're talking about, where this is fact. I mean, that's what fascinates me, is you can't dispute what you're finding with your studies. So this is just fascinating to me. I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, happy to do it, Dan, and happy to do it again. The one thing, you're exactly right. We can't dispute what we found, but what we can dispute is why.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what's fun, is trying to figure out and explain with what we've seen as a hunter, trying to reconcile our hunting background and then also with the biology side of it. So that's what really makes it fun. And as I said, Dan, when we're working through this part 2, we're going to be reaching out to people like you. Take a look at this, see if it makes sense. What's an alternative explanation? And because what we want to do with this is to get it out there and answer as many questions as we possibly can. Mm-hmm. And we can only do that if we get feedback from people like y'all.
Right.
Before I finish my question too, as a new hunter, I appreciate your guys' studies and everything as well. And then being in a state where we have a very high buck limit, studies are very appreciated so that we can show commissioners and such while we're trying to convince them to fix the problem. So it's nice to have you guys.
Thanks a lot.
So the last question was, of course, the last question was from Pharaoh. It says, how much buck movement in bedding is to regulate?
I didn't get the last 4 or 5 words. How much of buck movement is
To regulate their core temperature? Oh, I dropped, I think.
Jeremy? Could
How much of buck movement in the bedding areas is to regulate their core temperature, I believe is the question.
I think very little. I think very little is about core temperature, with the exceptions of again, we're in the deep South. We have a few cold days, but it is nothing like Wisconsin. This is more anecdotal and less about data, but I fully believe here in the South, when we have these really, really cold days, Dan, that are 40 degrees. No, when we do occasionally get below 20 or sometimes below 10, I do think that affects where a buck is going to bed during daylight hours, so it can take advantage of solar radiation. Some of the stuff we're doing now, we haven't reported yet, is we're monitoring temperature in different forest scenarios. And it's very easy in the South because of sunlight. There can easily be a 20-degree or more difference between an area with a lot of solar radiation versus an area in the shade. So they can obviously move and bed in areas to get warmer or to seek refuge from the heat. But I think that the idea about the bed, it can be impacted by temperature. I think it's more about taking a load off and ruminating. And that is what is unique and special and so interesting about a ruminant like a deer. That foraging strategy evolved for them to eat as quickly as possible. They eat so quickly, they don't chew their food. They grab it and they swallow it. Then they're able to get as much food as possible per unit time, then go seek refuge, lay down, regurgitate, and now chew your food just like a cow does with its cud, process that food, and then digest it. So it's a really cool feeding strategy that deer have. So it's more about doing the food grab as quick as you can, and then getting into cover and regurgitating that food and ruminating.
No, awesome. So much great information in this podcast and in the publication. So we talked about a few places where people could find your information: the MSU Deer Lab website, the publications there. You mentioned your YouTube channel. Anywhere else people can find you or your information if they're interested in learning more?
Yeah, sure thing. So yes, our website, msudeerlab.com. MSU Deer Lab TV is our YouTube channel. And then, of course, on social media, Facebook and Instagram, MSU Deer Lab, just search that. That's all on the university and on the research side. On the private side, you can also find me and some people I work with in that regard for private land management at wildlifeinvestments.com. So you can look us up there as well.
All right. Well, thanks again so much. Appreciate your time. A lot of great comments, and a lot of people appreciate you in the chat too. So thanks so much, sir. And we'd love to have you back on in the future.
Happy to do it. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks for your time.